Imagine expanding your team's abilities without adding headcount. At Element 451, AI assistants like admissions advisors and student success coaches work alongside your staff to deliver personalized experiences at scale, offer round-the-clock support, and uncover data-driven insights. It's not just about doing more, it's about doing it smarter. Elevate your team with an AI workforce that delivers personalized, scalable, and impactful experiences across the student lifecycle. Learn more at element451.com. Hi, I'm a former Higher Ed CMO, and I have a confession to make. I really don't like the term content team. I feel like it doesn't do a good job of encapsulating what those groups in higher education should be doing. I think that we should be focused instead on storytelling. And I think that there is so much opportunity to convey the value of what we do in higher education through storytelling in ways that reach audiences, tug on their emotions, and actually expand our reach beyond just those who follow us, because people share those impactful stories with their circles and with their circles. That's why I was so excited to bring Kristin Hanson on the show. She's a freelance editorial content writer and strategist who specializes in higher education, particularly in the fundraising and enrollment space. This is a great conversation about how to move away from that transactional, very matter-of-fact type of messaging into messaging that moves your audiences. So I hope you enjoy this show. You're listening to Confessions of a Higher Ed CMO, the podcast where marketing minds in higher ed come to pull back the curtain, spill a little tea, and talk honestly about what it takes to market in this industry. I'm Jaime Hunt, the founder of Solve Higher Ed, author of Heart Over Hype, and a former campus CMO who spent more than 2 decades navigating the weird, wonderful world of higher education marketing. This show is for the strategists, the storytellers, the change agents, and anyone who has ever tried to get Faculty Senate on board with a rebrand. Here we get candid about the challenges and share the ideas that are shaping the future of our field. Sound like your kind of conversation? Then let's get into it. I'm thrilled to be here with you, Kristin. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. I'm excited to be here.
This conversation, I think, is going to hopefully be really helpful for folks. I know we talk a lot in higher education about storytelling. When I was at Miami University, we actually built a whole storytelling unit because we wanted to think about it kind of beyond just content producers, right? Like you're just creating content that just feels so clinical. But I'm really excited about this conversation about storytelling. And you posted a couple of weeks ago on LinkedIn that you feel like institutions need to move from passive to proactive storytelling. I'd love to hear from you. What does that shift look like? What do you mean by passive to proactive, and how does that shift work in practice?
Well, first off, the fact that you had a storytelling unit is kind of like my dream when I worked on campus. Just to have a storytelling unit would be absolutely fabulous. And I think that's something that you should definitely export to other places through your firm. But kind of moving from passive to active is really kind of simple in that there are things that you're not going to be able to plan for. Major gifts, tragedies, things that happen in the world. But you can be proactive about the impact and your institution's own story. So higher ed is cyclical. You know what events kind of happen every year. You know what students are coming in every year. And so taking the time to really plan for how can we, while these students are here, tell the best stories that we can with them. It's not just, oh, we have the product, now we have to find the students. It's why don't we find the students and then we can develop the product later. Or we know this event is happening. We want to make sure that we have photography and videography and all of these other resources instead of trying to reconstruct it after the fact. It's always hard when I remember being on campus, particularly when I worked in the advancement side, and you wanted to tell student scholarship stories. Well, if you haven't followed that student from the minute they walked in the door, how are you going to tell their story other than in retrospect? Wouldn't it be cooler to have the life cycle of that story, or to follow them for a day in the life? So that's what I kind of mean by being proactive in storytelling rather than reactive. And that in and of itself requires having an infrastructure in place so that you can, one, create the planning, and then two, execute it.
What does that infrastructure look like?
So I think it can look, a storytelling unit is a great way to do that. I think it can look a lot of different ways. Part of it, speaking from the experience that I had when I worked in the development communications office at Johns Hopkins, we had a group of about 9 different people who all had different roles. So I was the only one who was tasked with just writing, but we had one person that was our filmmaker, videographer, who's dedicated to that. We had people who were dedicated to kind of the digital side. And so one of the things that I worked on with our director was to kind of create an editorial committee of sorts out of our own team. And that was, having people meet at a regular set, time to discuss ideas, and then also to be empowered to go out and find ideas. We called it kind of like a beat system. Newspapers are so different, if they exist. Newspapers are so different than they were 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. But for the Gen Zers, newspapers used to have beats. You used to have reporters they reported on education in the city. They reported on business in the city. They reported on the police, the crime in the city. And so what we kind of created was a system where everybody on our team, regardless of what their role was, had a set of 5, 6 departments across Johns Hopkins University in medicine that they were to stay in touch with over the course of the year. We tried to make it so that they met face to face about 4 times a year, obviously pre-COVID, and to just talk, to learn about what was going on with them, to be a conduit to them as to what are the stories that we're looking for, what are the priorities that we're looking to tell stories about. Because as much as an advancement, we like to think that everybody knows what the pillars and priorities of a campaign are, most don't. And so kind of telling them, here's the things that we're trying to fundraise around, what stories, what people, what interesting things are happening in your unit that might apply to this. And so we kind of had this whole news gathering operation, and then we would meet once a month and basically pitch different ideas related to different priorities. And so then so you have the people assigned beats, the people going out, getting the information, the meeting to synthesize that information or collect all of that information, and then creating a repository of all of the things that you're interested in, all the story ideas that you think have merit. And so when you want to tell a story about a scholarship student or research related to a specific, something happens in the state of medicine or something, you can go into your list and say, okay, do we have someone that we know about that could speak to this? And could we talk to them about this? And so having that type of planning, having that type of infrastructure in place means that you can respond better if you have to be reactionary, but you can also say, we want to have a story about scholarship students. We want to have a story about faculty who have endowed professorships. We want to have a story about something very specific about medical innovations being, translated into use. And so you have a kind of a running list of those stories that you can go to and pull into time and again, rather than saying, okay, well, we got to talk about a student. What do we do?
Right.
And so having that resource is so critical to telling a better story than just, here's a news release about this program. It's, okay, we know that this program is being announced. Who do we know that can speak to this program? Whose story can we attach to this program to make it come alive and make people interested in it, much more so than matter of fact headline, quote from the president, boilerplate, end of story.
I love that. And I know I'm going to get inquiries after this releases to talk a little bit more about that storytelling unit at Miami. Yep. So I'm just going to share that now. So we pulled in basically all of the storytellers. So the news writers on the team, the copywriters, so those that wrote copy for the view book, the website, yep, whatever, videographers, photographers, and moved them and content strategists, and move them into one unit that was headed by the woman who replaced me as the VP there. And so she oversaw all of those various storytellers. And we shifted that language to storytelling really intentionally, in part because when I was at UW Oshkosh, there was a lot of conflict between the creatives and the content people, right? And it was seen as the creatives do the creative work and the content people are producing
Right. Like
products, right?
news versus
Yes.
features type of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there was just sort of this like, but everybody is a storyteller. Whether you're telling the story to your point from a news angle or you're writing marketing copy, good marketing is storytelling, right? It's not just listing features and facts about the institution, it's telling stories. And good PR and good media relations is storytelling too. And
Mhm.
you get that bigger emotional connection, to your point, to what is happening when you think about it through a storytelling lens versus just a news lens. And so I think making that shift in our department to create that storytelling unit really changed how people thought about their work. It had our photographers thinking about, this isn't just taking pictures at an event. How am I going to tell stories with the images that I take at this event? We did a bunch of like visual story packages that were pretty much just photos and videos with, limited copy, because all of that is storytelling and it's so,
For
so
sure.
important. And I loved in what you wrote before that you talked about, don't just introduce the program, find the people. And oh, we have this new masters or whatever, finding the people that can talk about the impact of that. And I'm really curious about why you think higher ed struggles with that, because usually you're completely right, it's this fact, quote from the president, boilerplate approach to news, and to releasing information. Why do you think higher ed struggles in that space?
For sure. I'll get to that in a second, but I wanted to piggyback off of something you said, particularly when it comes to like PR and even enrollment marketing. We hear, and there have been a number of things. I think it was a couple of weeks ago with your podcast with Daniel Andriani when he was talking about, kind of how creative has gotten very stale at higher ed and in other places as well. But storytelling is really where you find the differentiation between one institution and another. It's not the slick branding. It's not the slick. I mean, that it can be that, but we're always thinking about like what's going to be the new thing that we're going to be attached to, and really we should be thinking more about what makes us unique are the people that we have here, the students that are coming through, the faculty members, the staff member that's been there for 50 years. Storytelling is really where you find your differentiation as an institution within an industry where campus to campus, there's not a whole lot different,
Right.
especially in between certain classes. I mean, I love my alma maters very much, but I've also been working at other campuses where the offerings are virtually the same. What makes everything different is the people. And so doubling down on storytelling is where you can really tell either the media, prospective students, prospective parents, this is how we're different, the experience of these people. But I think the
I
reason
love
why a
that.
lot of institutions don't or can't kind of put this type of proactive storytelling together is pretty simple. It's time. I mean, anybody who has worked in higher ed marketing in whatever iteration it is, advancement, enrollment marketing, whatever, you're constantly juggling priorities. You've got things coming from kind of the executive team. You've got things coming up from different departments. You've got things coming in from admissions. And it's really hard to kind of be the air traffic controller that, says, okay, this goes here, but this has to stop. Air traffic controller might not be the best analogy at this moment in time, but we're going to use it because it's very easy and visual. But it is very difficult in when you're getting all of those things from different sides to say, hold up, what can we do better? And so I think really having leadership in the marketing or in the communications department who's able to say, okay, let's find a process for determining how we prioritize these things and when we're going to tell certain stories and when we're not, when we're going to say yes and when we're going to say no. I think that's really important. It's something that's very difficult. I know from the experiences of my bosses that can be a very difficult thing to do, but it's very important to do. And the other is resources. A lot of places, especially if they're smaller institutions or they're institutions that aren't super well off financially, they may not have a lot of people in their communications department. They might be teams of one or two or three. And so the idea of spending a week going out across your campus and talking to people and getting their stories and then collecting them and then deciding which ones you're going to tell. I mean, that's just it's a zero, resources can be a very zero sum game. And so I think time and resources, whether they're human resources or financial resources, are the reasons. I don't think it's where they're saying, yeah, we don't want to tell these stories, we just want to tell this boilerplate stuff. I don't think any university president or any university communications director is going to tell you that's what they want. But sometimes the realities get in the way of the ideal.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And when I think about when I've had small shops, a lot of what we did to get those stories told is focus on pitching them to media and kind of let them do the heavy lifting. And then we share those media stories on
Yeah.
our website. So, if we have some big, cool student story that's just amazing and unique, getting multiple media outlets to kind of tell that student stories from different angles and then sharing that across social and on our websites and kind of let them do the heavy lifting when we were down a writer. It checked a lot of boxes. Not only did it get those stories told, but it also gave you that like media relations. The reason we do it is to get that external confirmation or that external credibility around the story, to get that broader reach to different audiences beyond the audiences that you have. So I think if you think about how can I might know this is a great story. I don't have the time to pursue it in the depth that I think that it probably could be covered. How can you leverage those media outlets that you work with to kind of tell that story? And I want to kind of pivot a little bit because in your post, you talked about storytelling as a tool for persuasion and value demonstration. How do you recommend that marketers show their internal stakeholders that this deeper storytelling is worth the time and effort or worth bringing in a freelancer?
So that's the $1 million question with just about all communications, because it's really difficult to, draw the straight line, the causality link between this particular piece of content and this particular outcome. Something we struggled with all the time, particularly with advancement, with, did this particular content yield X number of gifts? It's really hard. It could be a factor, it could be one of many factors. So the strict metrics can be really difficult to get. There are certain ways you can do that. You can set up certain tests. So if you have a regular newsletter and there's a place in the newsletter for this type of content, you can track how that particular content performs versus other things within that newsletter. You can do that with social media as well. That takes a little bit of time to set up and may not be, if you are under the pressure of constant deadlines, doing that may not be the easiest. But if you can, that's a great way to kind of compare and contrast how many people paid attention to this article versus how many people paid attention to this story. Another thing that I always wanted to do when I was a university magazine editor was send out surveys after we sent issues. So, like a month after sending out the issue, sending a quick 5-question survey to ask people, what are the things you remember most about this article? What did you read? What did you not read? And so that type of, almost, it's like a cross between quantitative and qualitative data in terms of feedback. But I think a lot of it tends to be more anecdotal. I know in advancement in particular, one of the things that I tried to do, because usually with the stories that we were putting together, we were working with people who worked on campus, but we were also working with gift officers. And so I would have conversations with the gift officers and say, how did the donor that you talked to, what did they think about this article? Did they read it? Did they not read it? Was it useful to you? And being able to communicate at the time through my director what the value of that particular content was. So it's hard to quantify, but I think the more that you can try and put some numbers behind it and then do the effort of some qualitative research on the back end is really helpful in kind of showing that. It's also great if you can find examples from other places. So if you see, people getting big gifts off of certain articles, following certain articles, or you see people winning awards for certain types of writing, that could also be something that says, hey, we have stories that are just like this. If we took the same approach to this, we know that we could get this out to our donors, or we could get this out to our audience, and it would be probably very well received. Again, it's in this particular area with content, not necessarily like direct marketing or email marketing and stuff, it's sometimes harder to find that crucial link, that smoking gun, quote unquote, to, man, I have a lot of violent metaphors right now. Sorry about that. But that very strong correlation, even if you can't have the causality to show them the value of it. It's also helpful to, find champions around the institution who can talk about, how they felt if someone, I remember I did an article about someone who was in our physics department at Hopkins, and they'd never really been featured before. And, we wrote the article, and they said they were so floored that they were even featured, but they sent it out to all of their colleagues. They sent it out to family and friends, being able to say, if someone's really excited about being featured, they're going to send it out to a wider audience. And you never know who's reading that, and you never know what can come of that. So there's all kinds of ways that you can position it as valuable. You can also kind of prove the negative and say, do some research after a news release goes out, after a very boilerplate donor story goes out, and see if people actually remember it. Because if people don't remember it, it doesn't matter what you do. And I think back to another thing. I really liked that podcast that you did with Daniel a couple of weeks ago, where he talked about kind of the tension between the leaders of an institution and the academic center of an institution and the communicators and the audience that you're trying to reach. And you have to find a way to have the two meet in the middle. Because if you're writing all of these things that are very lofty language and very academic and very, theoretical, as the president or the provost or whoever wants, the parents and the students who are looking at possibly going to your institution, frankly, they're not going to care. They don't,
Right.
unless that's their goal for going to college, they're not going to care about that. They want to know, do you have the major that I want? Are the faculty that you have there well connected? Am I going to get a good education? Am I going to have connections to internships? Am I going to get the job after I graduate? And you have to be able to say, we need to tell stories about this that can bring in some sprinkles and flavor from that lofty academic speak. But if you are not talking in a way that the audience wants to hear it, if you're giving out dry boilerplate donor stories with grip and grin pictures, that's not going to inspire people to give to your institution, particularly if they're younger, particularly if they can't give at the 500,000 million plus level. You want to tell the stories that inspire them to give to the institution. You don't want to write all the stories related to, here, look at this great person who did this. There's a place for that. There's a time for that. And I do understand the importance of that from a stewardship standpoint. But if that's the only way you're telling these stories, you're not going to grow your audience. People are going to forget those stories. It's just not going to be worth the time and money that you've put into putting that story together.
Want to know what AI-powered people-focused really looks like? The 2025 Engage Summit will show you how AI transforms engagement without losing the human touch. Join us June 24th and 25th in Charlotte for actionable insights, hands-on demos, and transformative strategies. Enrollify listeners save $50 with code Enrollify50. Sign up at engage.element451.com. I couldn't agree more. And I think about how a lot of times we tell these very, very surfacey stories about, this student is a great student and they did something great in the classroom. And we don't dig deeper into what their journey has been. And if you think about storytelling, like in a film, in a book, in a novel, whatever, it follows like this certain pattern of like there's a hero, there's an obstacle, the hero overcomes the obstacle, the hero wins. They get the girl, they get the prize, they whatever in the story. They overcome the problem. And a lot of I think our higher ed storytelling just skips that whole there's a hero and an obstacle and just jumps right into and here's how they achieved their dreams. And that's fine, but that doesn't really our brains are wired for that other type of storytelling, that more compelling, more interesting. There's a reason why that has stood the test of time for hundreds and probably thousands of years, this sort of structure of a hero and an obstacle. And when we leave that out, I also think we're leaving out the people who see obstacles in front of them and think, well, that's great for this person, but I have this obstacle that I'm not going to be able to achieve what that person did because of this obstacle. When we show inspiring stories of people overcoming, I think that makes such a difference. And I'm so concerned in this country right now about the attack on university research.
Yeah.
And I shared a post a couple days ago trying to put a human face on that and talk about an experience that I had where university medical center and university research really saved my life. And I felt like that was more impactful and I guarantee had significantly more reach, more engagement, and that message got a lot farther than if I had just said university research is super, super important. We need to
Yep.
support university research. And that's what we need to be doing in higher
Right.
education is doing the thing that's going to get that emotional tug, that engagement, that sharing it, that getting that story a broader audience. And it's just a fact that fact-based, just bland, boring content is not going to accomplish that.
Absolutely. I could not agree with that more. And that's, I have been thinking about this since, the first news about cuts to the NIH and NSF and everything. And I mean, I worked at Hopkins for almost 5 years. So our team was interesting in that we were one of the only ones that spanned both the university and Johns Hopkins Medicine, which are two separate entities. And usually the communications teams don't, there's a university communications team, there's a medicine communications team, but for development, we served both. And so I got to do a lot of work for the first time, really, because I only worked at my alma mater, Elon University, before that, and smaller, very undergraduate focused institutions. So this was the first time that I understood what an NIH grant was, and I met with researchers who were developing certain things. And so I gained this whole wealth of knowledge that I would share with my family, with my friends, with all these other people when I would share the articles that I wrote that were talking about what people were doing, maybe not specifically related to NIH grants, but from philanthropy that was coming into Johns Hopkins Medicine, into the School of Public Health, and all of these things. It made this type of stuff real. It's not these people in this nondescript building wasting dollars with overhead to do absolutely nothing but navel gaze at their very specific thing. I learned about basic science research. I'd never really heard the term basic science research until I worked at Hopkins, but I learned how critical these types of very niche studies are in order to kind of form the building blocks that eventually becomes a treatment, that eventually becomes a vaccine. And so I'm sitting here seeing these news articles about the cuts, and I'm like, this is happening because the vast majority of people in this country, even highly educated people in this country, have no idea how much basic science research happens at academic medical centers throughout the country actually has a direct tie to their lives or to the lives of a loved one that they have. And it's because these institutions have felt they don't have to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody just knows, like, we're great. And higher ed and academic medicine and healthcare, they have to stop that and start tooting their own horn and explaining it in terms that people understand. You can't talk to people in a very highbrow medical journal type way. You have to explain to them, here's how the research works in very easy to understand terms. Here's what translational research is. And here's how it works. Here's how clinical trials work. And there was a story that I wrote, I think it was one of the last ones I wrote before the pandemic came down. And it was about a researcher in the Department of Dermatology at Hopkins who had done a number of kind of like basic science and stem cell type research. But he was really interested in the idea of like skin regeneration. How can we help regenerate skin? And the application of that was he was trying to help wounded warriors who had amputation sites regenerate their skin and make their skin stronger, because one of the biggest issues that people with amputations have is that when the skin touches the man-made object, the skin breaks down. And so when the skin breaks down, you can't wear your the prosthetic. You can't wear the lower part of your leg. You can't wear the lower part of your arm. So you can't function. You can't live your life in an independent way. And so his whole research, and he had gotten some private philanthropy, but he had also gotten some research, some money from the Department of Defense to really develop this process to create tougher skin for amputation sites for veterans. And so this was a phenomenal story that was a very basic science story, but we took it from he started doing this research. The research was peer reviewed, did really well. Then he kind of created the protocol for using it. Then it was the clinical trials. Now he's doing it in vivo with people in the Department of Defense and talking to people from the military bases that were kind of applying the techniques that he was creating and getting the idea of this thing that this professor had worked on in a lab for years and years and years is now making people's lives better because they can wear their orthotics for longer and they can maintain their independence for longer. And you can tell that story by saying that this scientist got X number of dollars from the Department of Defense to do this research. You can do that. It's
Mhm.
perfectly factual and right. But who's that going to reach? Who's that going to inspire? Who's going to look at that and say, that's the kind of thing I'd like to give a gift to. Let me reach out to the gift officer whose name is at the end of that article, which it was essentially a giving article, but it got picked up by other parts of the institution who used it as just a regular article because we didn't write it as a gift article. We didn't write it as a donor story. We wrote it as a human interest story that happens to have a tie to philanthropy. And so you get more people interested in potentially supporting it, but you also demonstrate to them the value of research, of federal funds supporting something that is actually helping people. That is such a better story. And we need more stories of that from academic medical centers, from hospitals. I mean, the federal government should have been telling some of these stories as well,
Mhm.
because it's very easy to say, well, they're getting billions of dollars. What are we actually getting for it? You're getting a lot. You're getting a
Mhm.
ton, but
Right.
nobody knows because A, nobody's telling those stories. And if they are telling those stories, they're telling them in an exceedingly boring, non-detailed, non-human way.
Mhm.
And nobody wants that.
Right. No, it's what are you interested in? What stories do you read? Don't write
Exactly.
stories that aren't stories you would read. And people's time is so limited, and so giving them something that's actually worth their time to consume and makes them feel things, feel a connection, feel like, wow, that's amazing. I mean, the number of times I read something and then tell my husband about it, like, oh my gosh, I just read about this woman where this happened and that happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And I would never be like, "Oh, I just read this story about this gift and it was cool." Like, like who cares? Like that's that's not remarkable. I guess what we're trying to do is create stories that are remarkable, like literally in that term, worthy of people making remark and sharing.
And sharing, that's the big
Yeah.
thing. Like, are they sharing it with other people? Is it making them stop, think, process, and appreciate value enough to share with somebody else? Because also the value of a share is like, you're kind of staking your reputation a little bit on the things
Mhm.
that you share. If you're
Mhm.
sharing something that, for lack of a better term, sucks, like that
Right.
says something about like your taste. If you share something that, is really well researched or is really grabs you or has tugs at your heartstrings or just makes you care, you know, you're going to share that because that's going to not just expand the audience to other people, get other people to know about what that story is about, but it also shows that you're someone who reads these types of things. You're someone who cares about these types of things. And so, it's as much of an identity thing. Sharing is as much of an identity thing as it is a distribution strategy, so to speak.
Yeah. I'm thinking way back in my early days as a reporter, the school district that I covered was doing a referendum to increase property taxes to be able to, do a number of things. And I did a 3-part series that actually dug into the impact of what would happen if they didn't get those dollars. And so actually showing this is a class and this is sort of all the cool things that are happening in this class. However, this class is going to be canceled next year without this funding. Or this is a student who had, all this promise in the world, but they're going to have to cut the AP classes if they can't get this funding or whatever, to try to tell a bigger story that this isn't just dollars and cents. We get real focused on dollars and cents. It's not, we can't just be focused on dollars and cents. The dollars and cents aren't what move people to give you their dollars and cents, right? Like
Hmm.
you have to have a story there. So I love that. I would love to hear because I talk to a lot of writers who are really thinking about how AI is going to change their work. And I'm really curious about how you see AI as a support, but not a replacement for storytelling in higher education.
Yeah, and it's been tough for me because I remember the first couple of times I kind of played with Chat GPT and I was like, this just either I'm not good at writing prompts or this just isn't for me. I just it the results were very bland. I didn't necessarily trust what it was giving me from a research standpoint, and I kind of got to the end of it and I was like, I would do it would be faster if I just did this myself. One thing that I think has really helped me as a higher ed related writer and that type of writing and other types of writing, when you are dealing with lots and lots of background information and also very high level, very academic journal type, that type of speak that's sometimes difficult to understand if you don't have a background in it. My go-to AI that I use all the time is Notebook LM, because
Mm-hmm.
you can it uses a finite, it only gives you information from the sources you provide it. So if you're giving it sources that you trust, your interview transcript, your meeting notes, your PDFs that you've downloaded for research, the journal article written by the faculty member that you've interviewed, you can put all of that in Notebook LM and then ask it questions, and it gives you the answers based on what you've fed it. So for me, most of the work that I do isn't go out and do a whole bunch of research randomly on the internet and then write something. It's I'm interviewing people, I'm looking at documents from different types of, whether it's journal articles, whether it's a brochure from years ago or something like that. And so previously, I would take all of that information, I would write it down, I would highlight it, I would get a big messy Word doc, and then I would reorganize it and everything. And now with Notebook, I can take that the time that I spend synthesizing that is shrunk tremendously, because I can ask it the specific questions that I think make the story. Sometimes I'll even ask it, like, give me how would you put together a very rough outline of this? And so it gives me kind of basics. And then I say, I like this, I don't like this, I move it around. And then it also will link you to the parts of your source material that it's pulling from. And so you can go back to that exact part of the source material and then take the actual source material, bring it into your outline. And so my whole process from going from interviews and research to writing has shrunk tremendously by using Notebook. So I think when you use it as an assistant in that way, it is, I mean, frankly, it's an overused term, but it's game changing. This is
Yeah.
the type of thing that could have taken hours, maybe days. And instead it's taking me maybe an hour or two to upload everything, ask it my questions, put the outline together and review it. So that's one way I think can be really helpful, particularly in higher ed, where you may be using a lot of historical documentation. You may have things, you can even ask it, you put in an article that you are like, I'm not reading 70 pages about this topic. Tell me in layman's terms in 2 minutes what this is about. And it will, it will give you that, but then it also gives you the places where you can go back and check and make sure that it's accurate very quickly. So that's really helpful. ChatGPT I tend to use now as kind of when I'm stuck with something, particularly like headlines and subheadlines or something. I just need something to start riffing off of. And
Mm-hmm.
so I work for myself. I don't have anybody here. My husband's not a writer. So I basically need somebody to throw ideas off of. And so I'll use ChatGPT for that, because usually after an iteration or two, I'll be like, I like that. Let me play with that. And that'll help speed that process. But I think the best thing that we can do is use it to find process efficiencies, not to
Mm-hmm.
write our content, not to create our content, but where can we find process efficiencies? And that's because if you can find process efficiencies, then that opens up opportunities for other things. If you're not spending as much time putting those outlines together, you can spend more time on campus talking to people to give you the ideas that then feed into what you're talking about. If you have a big story document, a repository, a Excel document with all of your story ideas, you can use that to like query it and say, all right, I need a story about a student in this particular area and it needs to hit on this particular priority. And you just ask, the AI for that. And there it is. Agents can be really, really helpful in that regard. I think you could, maybe I could see a very, visionary institution kind of creating its own agent that is automatically fed the institution's strategic plan or its campaign documents. So it knows like here are the things that we care about. And then you say, I have this particular story idea. Tell me how I can connect this to these priorities. And then boom, there's your idea. And then you can go run with it and create. So there are a lot of ways that it can be useful. Again, I'm always like, is this really a good use of the ecological resources that AI uses? So that's always kind of in the back of my mind. So I don't use it a ton. But when I can find those process efficiencies, it's really, really valuable.
I love the idea of improving productivity and freeing up that brain power so you can spend it on the creativity of writing, the strategy of writing, and the strategy of like figuring out how you're going to message it. And I think one thing that ChatGPT or Copilot or whatever your favorite Gen AI tool is can also help you figure out how to repurpose that content in snippets. Like, what's the most compelling piece of this content that I could pull out to do, a newsletter, like a newsletter snippet? How might I reframe this for a article on the student's home department's website? How can I reuse this for social media or whatever? And now I know a lot of people do video storytelling. I know there's a lot of tools out there that can also go through your whole raw video. They can take a video from an event and identify for you what those really catchy snippets at that event might be for a recap video or something like that. And that saves you having to sit and watch the whole thing from beginning to end with your little notebook and write down the 11 dot dot 13 dot dot 14 through the amount of time that I used to spend trying to find that exact snippet. AI can do that for you now so that you can be more focused on. I think it opens you up to do better storytelling because now you have more time to focus on that.
Yeah. And to find the stories, because that's really where, if I think back to when I worked on campus, it's the spending time with people and spending time with people multiple times so that they know kind of what you're looking for. So when they're out in their world, if they hear something and they're like, you know what, that's something that Kristin might be interested in for a story.
Right.
Having the closer relationship you have with these people, the more they're going to be able to feed you the stories. And the more you're out walking around on your campus and seeing what's happening, the more you're going to be able to feed that your AI database the ideas that then you can use to create. So, instead of spending, saying, oh, I don't have the time to talk to people, I don't have the time to find these stories. Well, no, now you do, because you're compressing the amount of time that you're doing on kind of this administrative stuff here. Now go out and talk to people and find the stories that are going to make the difference, that are going to leap off the page to people.
I love that, leap off the page. That's what we're trying to do, right? I think as we're thinking about, making stories leap off the page, creating opportunities for people to want to share and get our stories across the globe, which is really, I think, ultimately the goal of this storytelling is to get broader awareness, broader reach. How can people find you if they want to chat with you and learn more?
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I love talking about this stuff. Anybody who knows that asks me questions about that stuff probably knows I'll talk your ear off about it. But I have a website. It's KristinHansonWrites.com. That's Kristin with 2 I's, and it's Hanson like the band. I know there's a certain subset of the population that probably now is too young to know what Hanson is, but it's Hanson. My email is just Kristin, again with 2 I's, at KristinHansonWrites.com. I am on LinkedIn. You can just search for Kristin Simonetti Hanson. I'm on Instagram at Kristin Hanson Writes, and I am on Blue Sky, but I am at khansonwrites.bsky.social. So yes, there's a lot of different ways to get in touch with me, and I welcome anybody who wants to just riff off some of these ideas anytime.
Awesome. Well, listeners, as you know, you can always find me on LinkedIn at Jaime Hunt, Jaime. You can find me on my website, soulofhighered.com, or my book website, which is heartoverhypebook.com. And I'm always eager to chat with listeners. If you have any questions, particularly around the storytelling unit that I stood up at Miami and how we did all of that, happy to chat about that or anything else in this episode. And until then, let's go bust some silos. Thanks for listening to Confessions of a Higher Ed CMO. This show is a proud member of the Enrollify Network, home to Higher Ed's largest collection of podcasts. Enrollify is where Higher Ed goes to grow, so be sure to check out our other podcasts, webinars, video clips, blogs, and more. Visit enrollify.org and subscribe for all the latest details and contact drops directly to your inbox. Enrollify is brought to you by Element 451, the digital workforce platform for higher ed. Learn more at element451.com.